Hey everybody, Matt Johnston, and we're back. We're still talking about COVID, but we're talking about what's likely to come from OSHA in advance of the emergency temporary standard that OSHA has been directed to provide for companies with 100 or more employees. So before we get started talking about that, please do me a favor and click the subscribe button that you see down there below. And if you hit the little bell, you'll also get notifications when we have new content available. So if you recall, in September, President Biden issued a couple of executive orders. The first executive order dealt with a requirement that federal employees be vaccinated against COVID-19. The second executive order directed OSHA and other government agencies to prepare regulations requiring companies, private companies, with 100 or more employees to have their employees vaccinated or to provide regular weekly testing for those companies. So one of the things that we've been sort of waiting on is what is OSHA's standard going to be? So they'll be issuing what's called an emergency temporary standard, and this is going to be essentially the regulation requiring vaccinations. So while everybody's been waiting with bated breath about what's going to happen, the federal government has quietly issued some new guidance for its agencies, so for federal agencies. And those agencies are going to be required to obtain certain kinds of documentation from employees. And those, the FAQs that they have put out have essentially been, that's essentially going to be probably the guidance that we're going to get from OSHA for private employers. It may not be exactly the same, but it's going to be pretty close. So I've provided a link to the updated federal employee FAQs down below, but I wanted to talk about a couple of things that are within the FAQs. And the first is that you're going to have to provide, evidence of the vaccination. So it's not going to be any surprising what's going to be accepted. Your vaccine card, copy of your personal medical records from your doctor or from a pharmacy, things of that nature. So no surprise on the kinds of documentation. What is a little surprising to me is that federal employees are required to certify under a penalty of perjury that the documentation that they submit is true and correct. So that's an interesting standard for me. You're requiring an employee to provide something that is, and stating that it is true or correct under penalty of perjury, which could lead an individual employer, or in this case a federal agency, to terminate an employee if it turns out that the record is not correct. Now, you get into some kind of interesting questions about what if the employee believes it to be true and correct and it turns out to be an error. There turns out to be some sort of mistake made by the healthcare provider. The second order effect of that is you're going to see a lot of people going, wait a minute, I thought it was true and accurate. That's my belief. Why am I being penalized for a mistake that my medical provider did? The other thing that is interesting, and this is one of the big debates, is whether somebody who has had COVID-19, most people then have the antibodies that are part of that, and there's this kind of notion of natural immunity. Now, I don't want to get into whether or not natural immunity is real or not. That's not the point of this. But an employee will not, I repeat, not be able to provide an antibody test as proof of vaccination status. So this is for federal employees, remind you, but that's an interesting sort of thing. We'll see how that plays out. The other notion that has always been an issue, and I've always recommended employers if you are a private employer and you want to require vaccination status in order to come into the office, you do have to provide an exemption for either sincerely held religious beliefs or a medical exemption. And there is guidance dealing with medical and or religious exemptions. The federal government has even helpfully put together a couple of fancy forms that could then be modified to use. by employers, but you're still required to provide that legally required religious exemption or medical exemption for getting a vaccine. But then you are required, federal agencies would be required to maintain other protocols such as physical distancing, masking, testing protocols, and things of that nature for individuals who are not fully vaccinated. So to me, this provides a rather interesting problem from an academic sense for the federal government, and it could provide a very real legal problem for employers, because we have the issue of Title VII. Title VII is the Anti-Discrimination Act. It's the Federal Civil Rights Act that prohibits discrimination in hostile workplaces in a workplace. So what happens when there are employees who cannot get the vaccine for a medical reason, or choose not to get a vaccine for religious reasons, or simply choose not to get a vaccine, and an employer is segregating them off? That then becomes a question of, is it possible that an employee could make a claim for a hostile workplace, particularly if there is activities of shunning, retaliation, termination of employment, demotion, change of job duties without any real reason other than the fact that somebody has chosen to adhere to their religious practices or to follow a medical provider's guidance about not getting a vaccine. So if you are a private employer and you're going to require vaccines, which again, as I've stated many times, is legal, you do have to provide the exemptions for religious and or medical conditions, and you do have to make sure that you are not retaliating or allowing a hostile workplace to generate based upon particularly a religious matter. So somebody who has chosen for religious reasons not to get a vaccine, you cannot discriminate nor allow harassment of that particular individual based upon their religion. And that is a real potential case here. And so it will be interesting from an academic sense at the federal level, but a very real and practical sense at the individual private employer level as to what would happen in these sorts of situations. Currently, politically, for whatever reason, we tend to have an awful lot of political wrangling regarding vaccines, and so if you are a private employer and you have individuals who are asking for a religious exemption, I strongly encourage you to communicate with your legal counsel to make sure and to take steps to prevent hostile workplaces based upon religion. In the meantime, we will stay on top of what OSHA is doing. Hopefully we will get some sort of guidance here in the next week or so about what the emergency temporary standard is going to look like. And in the meantime, go out and watch some live soccer. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.